The night everything changed started like any other Tuesday in September. I was alone in my workshop behind the house, trying to fix an old radio that belonged to my grandfather, when the power went out. Not just in my house, but everywhere. The entire neighborhood plunged into darkness so complete it felt like the world had been erased. That's when I heard it. A sound I still can't properly describe, like metal tearing through dimensions, followed by the most profound silence I've ever experienced. I stepped outside expecting to see my neighbors checking their breakers or looking for flashlights. Instead, I found something that would shatter every assumption I had about reality. There, collapsed in my backyard near the old oak tree, was a figure that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. Not human, but not entirely alien either. Something caught between worlds, bleeding a substance that shimmered like liquid starlight. For 3 days, I harbored this being in my home. 3 days during which everything I believed about humanity, about our place in the universe, about our future, was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. What this visitor told me about our species will keep me awake for the rest of my life, because we are not what we think we are. We never have been. My name is David Chen, and I'm a telecommunications engineer from Portland, Oregon. I fix cell towers and maintain radio equipment for a living. I mention this because what I'm about to share with you goes against every logical, rational instinct I've developed over 37 years of life. I'm not someone who believes in conspiracy theories or supernatural phenomena. I've always been the guy who explains away strange sounds, who finds the rational explanation for unusual events. Until 3 weeks ago, I would have dismissed a story like this as complete nonsense. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't care whether you're ready for it or not. It doesn't ask permission to shatter your worldview. And sometimes truth arrives in your backyard, bleeding and desperate, speaking in frequencies your brain can barely process, carrying knowledge that changes everything. The being I found that night wasn't what you might expect from science fiction movies or popular alien encounter stories. No gray skin, no large black eyes, no sleek metallic spacecraft. This entity appeared more like condensed energy wrapped in something resembling flesh, constantly shifting between solid and translucent states. When it spoke, which took nearly 6 hours after I first discovered it, the words didn't come through sound, but through direct transmission into my consciousness. Imagine hearing your own thoughts, but knowing with absolute certainty they originated from someone else. During those first terrifying hours, as I helped this being recover in my basement workshop, I experienced something psychologists might call cognitive dissonance, on a scale I didn't know was possible. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that there had to be a logical explanation. But the evidence was undeniable. This thing was real. It was injured, and it needed help. The decision to hide, rather than report what I'd found, came from pure instinct. Something deep inside me understood that involving authorities would be catastrophic, not just for the being, but for humanity itself. As the hours passed and we began to communicate, I learned that this intuition was absolutely correct. What this visitor revealed about government knowledge, about decades of contact and cover-ups, about the real reasons behind official secrecy, painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than any conspiracy theory I'd ever heard. But the truly haunting revelations weren't about government conspiracies or hidden technologies. They were about us, about human nature itself, about patterns this being's species has observed across countless worlds and civilizations, about what they've witnessed happening to humanity over the past century, and what they predict will happen next. You see, we are not alone in the universe, not even close. According to my visitor, consciousness is as common as hydrogen, appearing wherever conditions allow complexity to emerge. What's rare, almost impossibly rare, is what they call sustainable wisdom. The ability for a species to develop advanced technology without destroying itself or others. Out of thousands of civilizations they've encountered, fewer than 12 have achieved this balance. Humanity, they told me, is currently failing this test spectacularly. The being I sheltered, who asked me to call him Keeper for lack of a better translation, belongs to what he described as a monitoring network. Not invaders, not saviors, but observers whose job is to document the rise and fall of intelligent species across the galaxy. They've been watching Earth for over 200 years, taking careful notes as we've progressed from pre-industrial society to our current state of technological advancement paired with psychological immaturity. What they've documented about us is both fascinating and terrifying. Keeper explained that every species goes through what they call the integration crisis, the period when a civilization develops enough power to significantly alter their environment and reach beyond their home planet, but hasn't yet developed the wisdom to handle that power responsibly. Most species, he said, don't survive this phase. The symptoms are always the same. Rapid technological advancement coupled with increasing social fragmentation. The development of weapons capable of planetary destruction, alongside the inability to resolve basic conflicts peacefully. The creation of global communication networks used primarily to spread misinformation and hatred. The discovery of their planet's finite resources occurring simultaneously with the complete inability to manage those resources sustainably. Sound familiar? According to Keeper, humanity entered our integration crisis approximately 150 years ago, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Since then, his people have been watching with growing concern as we've displayed every warning sign of a species heading toward self-destruction. But here's what makes our situation unique, and why Keeper's people have been debating whether to intervene. We are the first species they've encountered that seems to be conscious of our own destructive patterns while being completely unable to change them. Previous civilizations that failed their integration crisis did so gradually, unaware of what was happening until it was too late. Humans, however, have identified virtually every threat to our survival: climate change, nuclear weapons, social inequality, resource depletion, the psychological impact of technology and shared reality, the breakdown of truth. We know exactly what's killing us, yet we seem powerless to stop it. This paradox has created unprecedented debate among Keeper's people. Some argue that our self-awareness makes us worth saving, that consciousness of our problems is the first step toward solving them. Others believe that our inability to act on our knowledge, despite having it, proves we lack the fundamental capacity for wisdom necessary to join the galactic community. But the most disturbing revelation came on the second day, when Keeper showed me what they call the pattern archive. Using a form of direct consciousness transfer that left me nauseous and disoriented for hours afterward, he shared selected memories from their observations of other failed civilizations. What I experienced in those downloaded memories will haunt me forever. I witnessed the final days of a species remarkably similar to humans, living on a planet they called Viridian. Like us, they had developed incredible technologies, created global communication networks, and reached the point where they could see their planet from space. Like us, they had identified the threats to their survival, but couldn't overcome their tribal instincts and short-term thinking to address them. I watched through Keeper's memories as their social media platforms, originally designed to connect people, instead divided them into increasingly hostile factions. I saw how their leaders, instead of uniting to face existential threats, used those very threats as weapons against their political opponents. I witnessed how their most intelligent individuals became so overwhelmed by the complexity of their problems that they retreated into cynicism and despair, while their most confident individuals, often the least informed, claimed to have simple solutions to impossibly complex challenges. The parallels to our current situation were so exact it felt like looking into a mirror, or perhaps more accurately, like seeing a preview of our own future. Viridian civilization lasted approximately 300 years after reaching their integration crisis before collapsing completely. Not from war or environmental catastrophe, though both played a role, but from something Keeper called truth decay, the gradual erosion of any shared understanding of reality, leading to the complete breakdown of their ability to function as a collective species. They literally argued themselves to death while their planet burned around them. Keeper told me that Earth is currently showing identical patterns to Viridian's final century. The same fragmentation of shared truth, the same inability to distinguish between information and manipulation, the same tendency for their most important debates to become tribal identity markers rather than genuine attempts to solve problems. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. According to Keeper, this pattern isn't random. It's not an inevitable result of technological advancement. It's a deliberate process, engineered by what he called influence networks. Other species far more advanced than humans, who have learned to profit from the integration crisis of younger civilizations. These entities don't invade in the traditional sense. They don't need to. Instead, they subtly amplify existing divisions within target species, accelerating the natural tensions that arise during technological advancement. They provide just enough additional confusion and conflict to tip developing civilizations past the point of recovery. The terrifying part is how subtle this process is. The influenced species never realizes they're being manipulated. They believe every destructive choice they make is entirely their own decision. The influence networks simply create conditions where the worst human impulses become the most profitable and appealing options. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than truth. Economic systems that reward short-term extraction over long-term sustainability. Political structures that benefit from division rather than cooperation. Information environments where outrage spreads faster than understanding. All of these, according to Keeper, show signs of external influence designed to accelerate our self-destruction. The goal isn't conquest in any traditional sense. Its Harv influence networks move in to claim the resources as sting. Once a species destroys itself, these and technologies left behind, often using the ruins of dead civilizations as stepping stones to find and influence new targets. Earth, Keeper told me, is currently in the final stages of this harvesting process. The signs are unmistakable to anyone who knows what to look for. The increasing polarization, the breakdown of institutional trust, the rise of deliberately false information, the inability of even intelligent people to agree on basic facts about reality. We are being systematically prepared for collapse. But here's the thing that kept me awake every night since Keeper left. He also told me something else, something that changes everything about how we might respond to this threat. Something that his people have never seen before in any other species they've monitored. Humans possess what he called anomalous empathy, our capacity to feel genuine concern for individuals we've never met, to sacrifice our own interests for abstract principles, to feel emotional connection to future generations we'll never see. This trait, while it makes us vulnerable to manipulation, also represents something unprecedented in their database of intelligent species. Most intelligent life forms, including Keeper's own people, operate on expanded versions of tribal loyalty. They care for their families, their communities, their nations, their species, in roughly that order. But humans regularly demonstrate care that extends beyond any rational self-interest. We rescue strangers from burning buildings. We donate to causes that will never benefit us personally. We create art and knowledge for people who won't be born for centuries. This anomalous empathy, Keeper explained, is exactly what's needed to survive the integration crisis. It's the psychological foundation required for species-level thinking and long-term planning. But it's also what makes us so vulnerable to the manipulation tactics used by influence networks. Our strength is being weaponized against us. And this is where Keeper's story takes a turn that I'm still struggling to process fully. His people, Keeper revealed, are facing their own crisis. For millennia, they've maintained strict policies of non-interference, documenting the rise and fall of civilizations without ever attempting to alter the outcome. It's a fundamental law among the monitoring networks, based on the principle that true wisdom cannot be imposed from the outside. A species must either develop sustainable consciousness on their own, or they don't deserve to survive. But humanity has broken their models. Never before have they encountered a species with such contradictory traits. We possess both the empathy necessary for galactic citizenship and the self-destructive impulses that typically doom civilizations. We're capable of extraordinary cooperation and devastating tribalism, sometimes within the same individuals. We create beauty while destroying our own habitat. We develop technologies to connect every human on the planet, then use those same technologies to spread hatred and lies. This paradox has created unprecedented division among Keeper's people. The traditional observers want to maintain their non-interference policy, arguing that if humanity cannot solve its own problems, intervention would only delay the inevitable. But a growing faction believes that our anomalous empathy represents something too valuable to lose, that perhaps the monitoring networks have a responsibility to preserve this rare trait for the sake of galactic evolution itself. Keeper himself belongs to a third group, one that operates in direct violation of their species' laws. They call themselves the Catalyst Network, and they've decided that subtle intervention might be possible without violating the core principle of non-interference. Instead of trying to save humanity directly, they're attempting to amplify our existing capacity for wisdom and empathy, hoping to tip the balance in our favor. This is why Keeper came to Earth, not to observe, but to plant seeds of understanding in select individuals who might be capable of spreading awareness without triggering the defensive reactions that typically doom such efforts. He wasn't supposed to make direct contact. His presence in my backyard was the result of what he called a navigation error caused by interference from one of the influence networks operating in our solar system. But even accidents, he told me, sometimes serve greater purposes. During our second day together, as Keeper's strength returned and his ability to communicate improved, he began sharing what he called essential knowledge. Information that might help humanity recognize and resist the manipulation we're experiencing. But he warned me that this knowledge comes with terrible responsibility. Once you understand how the influence networks operate, you begin to see their fingerprints everywhere. In the design of social media platforms that reward outrage over truth. In economic systems that prioritize quarterly profits over planetary survival. In political movements that offer simple answers to complex problems. In the gradual erosion of shared institutions that once helped societies make collective decisions. You start to recognize the subtle ways our worst impulses are being amplified and our best impulses are being suppressed. How algorithms designed to maximize engagement inevitably promote content that makes us angry, afraid, or outraged, because those emotions drive more interaction than contentment or understanding. How the most divisive voices are mysteriously amplified, while calls for unity and cooperation struggle to find audiences. You begin to see how we're being systematically trained to distrust expertise while embracing confident ignorance. How complex problems are being deliberately oversimplified into tribal identity markers. How our natural human tendency toward pattern recognition is being exploited to make us see enemies where we should see allies, and allies where we should see threats. But the most disturbing realization is how voluntary it all appears. The influence networks don't force us to make destructive choices. They simply create conditions where destructive choices feel more appealing, more profitable, or more emotionally satisfying than constructive ones. They've turned our own psychology against us so effectively that we police ourselves, attacking anyone who suggests we might be under outside influence. Keeper showed me examples from 17 different worlds where the same process had played out. Species after species, all convinced they were making independent choices, all following identical patterns of the self-destruction. The details varied, but the trajectory was always the same. First, the breakdown of shared truth. Then, the weaponization of information. Finally, the complete inability to cooperate even in the face of existential threats. What makes it so effective is that it feels organic. Each civilization believes its problems are unique, arising from their own specific history and culture. They never suspect that identical conflicts are being fomented simultaneously across multiple worlds, all serving the same harvesting agenda. But here's what gave me hope, even as it terrified me. Keeper explained that the influence networks aren't invincible. Their power comes entirely from their ability to remain undetected. They're parasites, not predators. They can amplify existing weak they-cannotnesses but create something from nothing. They can make us more tribal our capacity for EMP, but they cannot eliminate a thee. They can spread confusion, but they cannot destroy our ability to think clearly. Their greatest vulnerability is exposure. Once enough members of a target species become aware of the manipulation, the process begins to break down. Awareness creates immunity. Understanding the game changes how you play it. This is why Keeper's faction has decided to risk everything by sharing this knowledge. They believe that humans, with our anomalous empathy and our unprecedented self-awareness of our own flaws, might be the first species capable of recognizing and overcoming this manipulation while there's still time. But the window is closing rapidly. According to Keeper's calculations, based on patterns observed across multiple worlds, humanity has approximately 18 months before we reach what they call the point of no return. The moment when social fragmentation becomes so severe that we lose the ability to function as a collective species, regardless of the threats we face. After that point, no amount of external help can save us. The influence networks will have successfully turned us into a self-harvesting civilization, destroying ourselves while they profit from our collapse. On the third morning, as Keeper prepared to leave, he gave me what he called the final gift. Not just knowledge, but a tool, a way of seeing that, once learned, cannot be unlearned. He placed his hand on my forehead, and for a moment that felt like hours, I experienced what he called true sight. Suddenly, I could perceive the subtle influences that surround us constantly. I could see how information flows are being manipulated, how our emotional responses are being triggered and directed, how our attention is being harvested and sold to the highest bidder. I could recognize the difference between organic human thought and externally amplified impulses. It was overwhelming and nauseating, like seeing the matrix of manipulation that underlies so much of our daily experience. But it was also liberating, because once you can see the strings, you can choose not to dance to them. Keeper warned me that this gift comes with a price. I would now see the manipulation everywhere, in ways that would be impossible to ignore or forget. I would recognize how much of what passes for normal human behavior is actually the result of systematic psychological warfare designed to make us destroy ourselves. I would also understand my responsibility to share this knowledge, despite knowing that most people would reject it, dismiss it, or attack me for suggesting it. Because humans under the influence of these networks have been conditioned to view any suggestion of external manipulation as either conspiracy theory or personal weakness. But he also told me something that has kept me going through the darkest moments of the past 3 weeks. The fact that I was capable of helping him, of seeing past my initial terror to recognize a being in need, of choosing compassion over fear, proves that the manipulation hasn't won yet. Our anomalous empathy is still intact. Our capacity for wisdom is still functional. We can still choose differently. As Keeper prepared to depart, returning to whatever dimension or distant world he calls home, he left me with one final message. Not just for me, but for anyone willing to listen. The message that has compelled me to share this story, despite knowing how impossible it sounds, despite risking my reputation and my sanity. The influence networks succeed by making us feel powerless and isolated, by convincing us that our individual choices don't matter, that the problems we face are too big for ordinary people to solve. But this is their greatest lie. Every act of genuine empathy, every choice to seek truth over comfort, every moment when we choose cooperation over competition weakens their hold on our species. We are not powerless, we are not alone, and we are not doomed. But we are running out of time. The harvest is nearly complete, and the window for resistance is closing. What happens next depends entirely on how many of us can wake up to what's happening, how quickly we can learn to see the manipulation for what it is, and how effectively we can begin to make choices based on our own values rather than externally imposed impulses. Keeper told me that sharing this story would mark me as a target for increased manipulation attempts. The influence networks don't like exposure, and they have editing or ways of disk silencing those who threaten their operations. But he also said that every person who hears this message and begins to see clearly represents a victory against forces that have consumed thousands of worlds. The choice, as always, is ours. But now we know we're making it. The hardest part about carrying this knowledge isn't the weight of what I learned. It's watching the world continue exactly as before, while seeing the mechanisms of our manipulation operating in plain sight. Every news cycle, every social media controversy, every political debate now reveals itself as part of something larger and more calculated than I ever imagined. In the days following Keeper's departure, I found myself analyzing everything differently. The outrage that dominates our information landscape, the way complex issues get reduced to simplistic tribal positions, the mysterious amplification of the most divisive voices, while reasonable perspectives struggle to find audiences. Sight you cannot. Once you develop true, unsee the patterns. But what disturbs me most isn't the manipulation itself. It's how perfectly it exploits our genuine human emotions. The influence networks don't create our fears, our anger, our desire to belong. They simply redirect these natural feelings toward destructive ends. They've weaponized our empathy by showing us endless streams of suffering we cannot directly address, creating a sense of helplessness that makes us retreat into tribal thinking. They've perverted our love of truth by flooding us with so much information that we can no longer distinguish between facts and fabrication. The genius of their system is that it feels completely organic. When we share that inflammatory post, we believe we're standing up for justice. When we dismiss information that challenges our worldview, we think we're protecting ourselves from lies. When we attack those who disagree with us, we feel we're defending something precious. Every destructive choice feels righteous in the moment, because our emotions are being manipulated through frequencies we cannot consciously detect. I spent hours researching the psychological techniques Keeper had described, trying to understand how this influence operates on a neurological level. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The human brain, evolved for survival in small tribal groups, remains vulnerable to manipulation techniques that exploit our ancient wiring. We're hardwired to pay more attention to negative information because potential threats were once matters of life and death. We're programmed to trust information that comes from our perceived tribe and reject anything that seems to threaten group cohesion. These evolutionary adaptations, which served us well for millions of years, have become our greatest weakness in an interconnected world where information travels instantly, and tribal identity can be artificially constructed around almost any issue. The influence networks have essentially hacked our operating system, using our own biological programming to make us destroy ourselves. But understanding the mechanism also revealed potential solutions. If our vulnerability comes from our evolutionary wiring, then our defense must come from our uniquely human capacity for self-awareness and conscious choice. We can learn to recognize when our emotions are being manipulated. We can develop habits of thinking that make us less susceptible to artificial influence. We can choose to seek understanding rather than confirmation of our existing beliefs. This is what Keeper meant when he said awareness creates immunity. Not that knowledge makes us invulnerable, but that understanding the game changes how we play it. Once you recognize that your emotional responses might not be entirely your own, you can begin to examine them more carefully. When you feel sudden outrage about some distant event, you can ask whether that anger serves any constructive purpose or just makes you more likely to share inflammatory content. When you find yourself dismissing entire groups of people as stupid or evil, you can question whether such simplistic thinking reflects reality or manipulation. The process of developing this awareness is exhausting and often lonely. You begin to see how much of our daily discourse is artificial, how many of our strongest convictions are actually externally programmed responses. You watch friends and family members getting pulled into conflicts that serve no one's genuine interests, defending positions they adopted not through careful reasoning, but through emotional manipulation they cannot recognize. Worse, you realize how often you've fallen for these same tricks in the past. How many times your own anger and fear have been harvested and redirected toward purposes that had nothing to do with your actual values or interests. The humility this brings is crushing, but also liberating. If you've been manipulated before, you can learn to resist manipulation in the future. I started small, making tiny changes in how I consumed information and interacted with others. Instead of immediately sharing content that made me angry, I would wait 24 hours and see if I still felt the same way. Instead of dismissing people who disagreed with me, I would try to understand the fears or values underlying their positions. Instead of seeking information that confirmed what I already believed, I would actively look for perspectives that challenged my assumptions. These practices felt unnatural at first, like swimming against a powerful current. The algorithms that govern our information environment are designed to reward quick, emotional responses and punish careful, nuanced thinking. Taking time to reflect means missing the conversation. Seeking understanding rather than victory makes you appear weak to those caught up in artificial conflicts. Questioning your own assumptions feels like betraying your tribe. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The constant state of low-level anxiety and outrage that had become my normal baseline started to fade. I found myself less reactive to triggering content, more curious about different perspectives, more focused on solutions rather than problems. The world didn't become less complex or challenging, but it became more comprehensible. I could see the difference between genuine threats that required attention and artificial conflicts designed to waste my energy. More importantly, I began to recognize other people who were undergoing similar awakenings. They were everywhere once I learned how to look for them. Individuals who had grown tired of the endless cycle of outrage and division, who were quietly choosing empathy over anger, understanding over certainty, cooperation over competition. They rarely announced their transformation publicly, because doing so would make them targets for the very manipulation networks they were trying to escape. But you could see it in their behavior, in their questions, in their refusal to participate in obviously artificial conflicts. These people gave me hope, because they proved that resistance was not only possible but already happening. Humanity's anomalous empathy was reasserting itself despite every attempt to suppress it. Our capacity for wisdom was emerging even in environments designed to promote foolishness. The influence networks were powerful, but they were not omnipotent. However, my growing optimism was tempered by an increasing awareness of how little time we had left. The 18-month timeline Keeper had given me felt both impossibly short and terrifyingly specific. I could see the acceleration of the manipulation process, the increasing intensity of artificial conflicts, the growing polarization that made productive dialogue nearly impossible on almost any important topic. The signs of approaching collapse were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The breakdown of shared institutions, the weaponization of previously neutral domains like public health and scientific research, the rise of movements that offered simple explanations for complex problems, always identifying some group of humans as the source of all difficulties. The increasing inability of even intelligent, well-meaning people to find common ground on issues where their survival depended on cooperation. Most disturbing was watching how these patterns played out in my own community. Portland had always prided itself on being progressive and open-minded, but I could see how external influences were amplifying existing divisions, turning neighbors against each other over issues that had little to do with their actual daily lives. The homeless crisis, environmental concerns, educational policies, all became tribal identity markers rather than practical problems to be solved collectively. People I had known for years began expressing views that seemed designed more to signal group membership than to address real issues. Conversations became impossible, because any attempt to find nuance or common ground was interpreted as betrayal of the cause. The very empathy that made our community special was being weaponized to create guilt, shame, and paralysis around every major decision. I realized this was exactly what Keeper had meant about the harvesting process. We weren't being conquered by external armies. We were being trained to destroy ourselves while believing we were fighting for justice. Our best impulses were being redirected toward our own dissolution, and we were doing it voluntarily, even enthusiastically. But understanding the process also revealed opportunities for intervention. If the manipulation worked by amplifying existing divisions, then healing required finding ways to bridge those divides without triggering defensive reactions. If the influence network succeeded by keeping us focused on artificial conflicts, then resistance meant redirecting attention toward genuine shared interests and values. This became my mission in the weeks following Keeper's departure. Not to convince people that they were being manipulated, which would only trigger their psychological defenses, but to create spaces where our natural empathy and wisdom could reassert themselves. To ask questions that helped people examine their own motivations and assumptions. To model the kind of curious, compassionate thinking that makes manipulation less effective. I started with small experiments. In online discussions, instead of arguing against positions I disagreed with, I would ask genuine questions about the experiences and values underlying those positions. Instead of sharing content that confirmed my existing beliefs, I would share stories that illustrated our common humanity across different perspectives. Instead of responding to inflammatory posts with counter-arguments, I would try to redirect conversations toward constructive solutions. The results were mixed but encouraging. Some people responded with surprise and gratitude to being treated as complex human beings rather than ideological opponents. Others became suspicious of my motives, wondering what agenda I was pursuing. But gradually, I began to attract a small network of individuals who were hungry for a different kind of dialogue, who were tired of the endless conflict and eager to find ways of thinking together rather than against each other. These conversations revealed something remarkable. Beneath the artificial divisions that dominated our public discourse, most people shared remarkably similar core values. They wanted safety and security for their families. They wanted meaningful work and fair compensation. They wanted their children to inherit a healthy planet and a functional society. They wanted to feel part of something larger than themselves while maintaining their individual dignity and freedom. The differences that seemed so insurmountable in political debates often dissolved when people talked about their actual lived experiences and genuine concerns. The single mother worried about her child's education, and the wealthy businessmen concerned about economic stability were often concerned about the same underlying issues, just from different vantage points. The environmental activist and the factory worker both wanted a future where their communities could thrive, even if they disagreed about specific policies. This discovery reinforced Keeper's message about humanity's anomalous empathy. When we connected as individuals rather than as representatives of abstract ideological positions, our capacity for understanding and cooperation was remarkable. The problem wasn't human nature. The problem was systems designed to prevent us from connecting authentically, to keep us trapped in artificial conflicts that served interests far removed from our own. But I also learned how fragile these connections were, and how quickly they could be disrupted by external manipulation. A single inflammatory news story could undo weeks of patient relationship building. A cleverly crafted social media post could trigger defensive reactions that made productive dialogue impossible. The influence networks had decades of experience in disrupting exactly the kind of authentic human connection that threatened their operations. This taught me that resistance required more than individual awareness. It required collective immunity, communities of people who had learned to recognize and resist manipulation together. Just as biological immunity works better when achieved by populations rather than individuals, psychological immunity needed to be developed at the social level to be truly effective. The challenge was building these communities without triggering the very defensive reactions that made them necessary. How do you tell people they're being manipulated without activating their psychological defenses? How do you create spaces for authentic dialogue in an information environment designed to promote artificial conflict? How do you help people develop critical thinking skills without making them feel criticized or judged? These questions became my obsession as Keeper's 18-month deadline grew closer. Because I was beginning to understand that sharing my story, as impossible as it sounded, might be the most important thing I could do. Not because people would necessarily believe the details about alien contact, but because the framework it provided might help them recognize patterns they were already unconsciously aware of. People knew something was wrong with our information environment. They could feel themselves being manipulated, even if they couldn't identify the source or mechanism. They sensed that their emotions were being exploited, that their attention was being harvested, that the conflicts consuming our society served interests beyond their own. What they lacked was a way of understanding these feelings that didn't require them to blame themselves or their neighbors for the problems we faced collectively. The story of the influence networks, whether people believed it literally or metaphorically, offered an explanation that could unite rather than divide us. It suggested that our worst impulses were being artificially amplified by external forces, which meant that our best impulses represented our true nature. It implied that the conflicts tearing our society apart were not inevitable expressions of human nature, but manufactured distractions from our genuine shared interests. Most importantly, it provided a framework for resistance that was both individual and collective. Personal awareness combined with social connection. Critical thinking paired with empathetic understanding. The recognition that we were under attack coupled with the knowledge that we possessed everything needed to defend ourselves. As I prepared to share this story publicly, knowing the risks involved, I found myself thinking constantly about the other civilizations Keeper had shown me. The species that had fallen to this same manipulation, convinced until the end that their self-destruction was entirely their own choice. The billions of conscious beings who had never realized they were part of a harvest, never understood that their conflicts were artificial, never discovered that their capacity for wisdom and empathy was exactly what was needed to save them. I thought about Viridian, arguing itself to death while its planet burned, about the other 16 worlds that had followed identical patterns of self-destruction, all believing their problems were unique, about the vast network of predatory civilizations that had learned to profit from the collapse of younger species, turning consciousness itself into a resource to be extracted and consumed. But I also thought about the anomalous empathy that made humans different from every other species in Keeper's database, about our unprecedented capacity for self-awareness, our ability to recognize our own flaws and choose differently, about the growing number of people who were already waking up to the manipulation, already choosing cooperation over competition, already demonstrating that another way was possible. The outcome was far from certain. The forces arrayed against us were powerful, sophisticated, and experienced. They had perfected their techniques across thousands of worlds and had never encountered significant resistance. The window for effective action was closing rapidly, and the vast majority of humans remained unaware that we were even under attack. But we possessed something no other species had ever brought to this conflict. We knew we were being manipulated, and we cared about beings we would never meet. We could imagine futures we would never see, and we could sacrifice our immediate interests for abstract principles. We could love strangers, forgive enemies, and choose wisdom over comfort even when it cost us dearly. These traits, which made us vulnerable to exploitation, also made us capable of resistance that no harvesting network had ever encountered. If enough of us could wake up in time, if we could learn to see the manipulation for what it was, if we could choose authentic connection over artificial division, we might become the first species to not only survive our integration crisis, but to turn it into an evolutionary leap forward. The story I'm sharing with you now represents the beginning of that possibility, not because it will convince everyone who hears it, but because it might help some people recognize what they already know in their hearts, that we are better than our worst impulses, that we are capable of wisdom despite our apparent foolishness, that we are not alone in the universe, and we are not doomed to destroy ourselves, but only if we choose differently than we have been choosing. Only if we can learn to see through the manipulation that surrounds us. Only if we can remember what it means to be human in the deepest, most empathetic sense of that word. The 18 months Keeper warned me about are now down to 15. The signs of approaching collapse are accelerating daily, but so are the signs of awakening, the quiet revolution of individuals who are choosing awareness over ignorance, empathy over anger, cooperation over competition. What happens next depends entirely on how many of us can make that choice, how quickly we can help others make it, and how effectively we can build communities of resistance that cannot be divided or conquered. The harvest is not yet complete. The story is not yet over. And the most important chapter may be the one we write together in the months ahead. But first, we have to wake up. And then, we have to help others wake up too. Because our anomalous empathy, our unprecedented self-awareness, our capacity for wisdom in the face of our own foolishness, these are not weaknesses to be exploited. They are superpowers waiting to be activated. The question is not whether we can resist the manipulation that surrounds us. The question is whether we will choose to resist it together while there's still time. The hardest part about everything I've shared isn't proving it happened. It's living with the knowledge while watching humanity sleepwalk toward its own destruction. Every morning, I wake up hoping the previous 3 weeks were just an elaborate nightmare. But then, I turn on the news and see the patterns Keeper described playing out in real time. Yesterday, I watched 2 neighbors who have lived peacefully side by side for 8 years get into a screaming match about a local ballot measure. Not a debate, not a discussion, but genuine rage over an issue neither of them had heard of 3 months ago. I could see exactly how their emotions were being manipulated, how their natural concerns for their community were being redirected into tribal warfare that served no one's actual interests. The woman on the left genuinely cares about children's education. The man on the right genuinely worries about property taxes affecting his elderly mother's ability to stay in her home. Both concerns are valid. Both people are decent human beings. But somehow, this simple policy question had been transformed into a test of their fundamental worth as people. Agreeing to compromise felt like betraying everything they stood for. This is what the harvesting process looks like up close. Not alien invaders with ray guns, but human beings destroying their own communities while believing they're defending them. The influence networks don't need to fire a single shot. They just need to make us forget that we're on the same side. I wanted to intervene, to help them see how they were being played against each other. But I've learned that direct confrontation about the manipulation only makes it worse. People who are under influence become more defensive when you point it out, more convinced that you're the real threat. The programming includes safeguards against exposure. Instead, I waited until they had exhausted their anger, then approached each of them separately. I asked the woman about her daughter's school experience, really listened to her concerns about overcrowded classrooms and outdated textbooks. I asked the man about his mother's situation, genuinely engaged with his fears about seniors on fixed incomes being priced out of their neighborhoods. Something remarkable happened in both conversations. Once they felt heard and understood, once amplified by their emotions weren't being artifice the conflict, they both began to see nuances they had missed before. The woman acknowledged that tax increases could hurt people who were already struggling. The man admitted that proper education funding was important for the community's long-term health. Neither completely changed their position, but both became curious about finding solutions that could address everyone's concerns, rather than forcing a winner-take-all battle. They began thinking like neighbors again instead of enemies. This small victory gave me hope, but also reinforced how much work lies ahead. If it takes this much effort to help 2 reasonable people have a productive conversation about a local issue, how can we possibly address the global-scale manipulation that's tearing our entire civilization apart? The answer, I'm beginning to understand, lies in multiplication. Every person who learns to see clearly becomes capable of helping others see clearly. Every authentic connection established makes the next connection easier. Every community that develops immunity to manipulation becomes a beacon for other communities seeking the same health. But the process has to be organic. It has to grow from genuine human relationships and real shared interests. The moment it becomes preachy or ideological, it triggers the same defensive reactions that make the original manipulation possible. I've been experimenting with what I call stealth empathy. Instead of trying to convince people they're being manipulated, I focus on helping them reconnect with their own deeper values and genuine concerns. Instead of arguing against artificial divisions, I look for authentic common ground. Instead of attacking the influence networks directly, I try to strengthen the human connections they're designed to destroy. The approach requires tremendous patience and humility. You have to genuinely care about people's real experiences and concerns, not just their potential role in some larger awakening. You have to be willing to be wrong about specific issues while remaining committed to the process of thinking together. You have to resist the temptation to feel superior to those who haven't yet recognized the manipulation, remembering that you were under the same influence until very recently. But when it works, the results are extraordinary. I've watched people rediscover their capacity for nuanced thinking. I've seen artificial enemies become genuine allies. I've witnessed small communities develop collective immunity to the kind of divisive messaging that once tore them apart. These experiences have taught me something crucial about the nature of the threat we face. The influence networks are powerful, but they're also brittle. Their entire system depends on keeping us isolated from each other, preventing authentic human connection, maintaining artificial divisions that make collective action impossible. When people begin connecting across those artificial divisions, when they start thinking together instead of against each other, the manipulation begins to lose its power. Not because the influence networks give up, but because their techniques become visible and therefore resistible. This is why Keeper's people believe humanity might be the first species to survive this particular form of attack. Our anomalous empathy makes us vulnerable to emotional manipulation, but it also makes us capable of healing the very divisions that manipulation creates. We can learn to see each other's humanity even across significant disagreements. We can maintain relationships even when we can't reach consensus on specific issues. These capacities are exactly what's needed to build the collective immunity that could save our civilization. But they have to be activated consciously and deliberately, because everything in our current information environment is designed to suppress them. The challenge is that most people don't realize they need to develop these capacities. They experience the symptoms of manipulation, the constant anger and anxiety, the sense that everything is falling apart, the inability to have productive conversations about important issues. But they interpret these symptoms as evidence that their opponents are stupid or evil, not as signs that everyone is being played by forces beyond their immediate awareness. This is where sharing my story becomes crucial, despite how impossible it sounds. Not because everyone will believe the details about alien contact, but because the framework might help people recognize patterns they're already sensing but can't quite name. The truth is, most people already know something is deeply wrong with our information environment. They can feel themselves being manipulated, even if they can't identify the source. They sense that their emotions are being exploited for purposes that have nothing to do with their actual interests. They recognize that the conflicts consuming our society serve someone's agenda, but they assume it must be the agenda of their political opponents rather than external forces seeking to weaken all of humanity. What the influence network framework provides is a way of understanding these feelings that doesn't require anyone to be the villain. It suggests that our current problems stem not from the fundamental evil of any human group, but from sophisticated manipulation designed to turn our strengths against us. This reframe makes healing possible in ways that blame-based explanations never could. Instead of asking who's responsible for our problems, we can ask how we've been prevented from solving them together. Instead of fighting over who's right about specific issues, we can examine how our thinking processes themselves have been compromised. Instead of trying to defeat our opponents, we can work together to defeat the forces that have made us opponents in the first place. The shift is subtle but profound. It moves us from a paradigm of scarcity and competition to one of abundance and cooperation. It suggests that we have more in common than our current conflicts indicate, and that our apparent differences often mask deeper shared values and interests. But making this shift requires courage, because it means abandoning the certainty that comes with simple explanations and clear enemies. It means accepting that we might have been wrong about some things, that people we've dismissed or attacked might have legitimate concerns, that the world is more complex and nuanced than our current information diet suggests. The 15 months Keeper warned me about are now down to 12. Every day, I see the signs accelerating, the manipulation intensifying, the window for resistance closing a little more. But I also see something else, something that gives me hope even in the darkest moments. I see people waking up. Not in dramatic revelations or sudden conversions, but in quiet moments of clarity when they choose understanding over anger, connection over division, truth over comfort. Whether you believe my story literally or see it as an elaborate metaphor doesn't matter. What matters is that you recognize the patterns, that you begin to see the manipulation for what it is, that you start making choices based on your own deepest values rather than externally imposed impulses. Because our anomalous empathy, our unprecedented capacity for wisdom in the face of our own foolishness, these aren't weaknesses to be exploited. They're superpowers waiting to be activated. The question isn't whether we can resist the forces trying to harvest our civilization. The question is whether we will choose to resist them together while there's still time.